Alright, hi guys. So what I wanted to do today is kind of bring Unit 1 to something of a conclusion. I know in the thing we're going to talk about industrial warfare and the war on the periphery, but I think I'll save the periphery for the beginning of Unit 2 and just kind of talk about then the transition from Great War to then World War. So what I want to do today is talk then about this concept of industrial warfare. And what industrial warfare is, the term is actually going to be coined by Erich von Ludendorff, who will later be one of the main commanding generals of the German army during this time. Remember, he, along with Paul von Hindenburg, was one of the architects of the Battle of Tannenberg. He'll later basically become de facto military dictator of Germany with Hindenburg later in the war. And both during the war and in his 1935 book, Totalen Krieg, he mentions this concept both of total war and industrial warfare. And what the term has come to mean is industrial warfare is the term that historians give the period of war following, the Napoleonic Wars, the gunpowder era, so the late 19th century, all the way through the atomic age. And what really defines industrial warfare is the mass adoption of industry, the mass adoption of rifles, artillery, planes, machine guns, tanks, all these modern industrial implements of war that historically nations would not have been able to furnish, okay? When we talk about the American Civil War, and we talk about things such as the Springfield rifle musket, the standard arm of the Union Army, okay? At most, Springfield Army made 1 million between January, or not January, but 1861. And, well, actually, we could even go back with the 1855 Springfield. So about 1 million from 1855 to 1865. And contractors from 1862 to 1865 made another 2 million weapons. So that's 3 million rifles total. But now armies are much bigger. You've got to account for wastage, weapons being sunk on sunk on ships, destruction, things like that. And so we see then the churning out of weapons, whether to equip new soldiers or to replace old weapons or things like that. How crazy does it get? Take the British Lee Enfield rifle that had a number scheme, and this is kind of an interesting facet for collectors out there, that the serial number would run from 1 all the way to 999. And then after, 9,999, it would go to 1A, then A, 999, then B, and then all the way through the alphabet. So what would happen is British factories were actually producing so many rifles that it was quite possible that from the same factory, okay, and I don't even mean just same rifle total, but just the same factory, whether it be Birmingham Small Arms or, RSAF Enfield or Ishapur in India or wherever, there might be as many as 6 rifles made in, say, 1915 alone that bore the serial number, 9562A. Because literally they're just going to keep building so many from that one factory. They'd burn through all the codes, have to restart at the beginning, burn through those codes, and on and on and on and on. Now, why do I mention that? Because what industrial warfare in this case is going to symbolize is that realistically this is a war of attrition. This is going to be a war, especially with trench warfare, the inability to flank. The question is, how many people can you kill, and how many people can you not get killed on your side? It is very brutal. It is ghastly. And at some level, it is a rejection of the historic ideas of war. Think about it. Okay, we mentioned the Austro-Prussian, the Franco-Prussian War in this course already. Well, Austro-Prussian War, 7 weeks. You fight the enemy to a standstill, and then you sue for peace. That's it. You get your war aims, and you're done. But now what we're seeing is instead, we're just going to, literally have to beat an enemy into submission. It's not about just encircling and trapping armies. It's not about mass surrenders. It's literally you have to destroy the entire infrastructure of the country. And why that's so important is what that's going to do is that will make it where once this war is over, okay, this is literally fighting to the death. And we're going to see this in the case of Germany. We're going to see this in the case of Russia, that this will change the map of Europe. So what makes this a necessity? Because this is not a limited war anymore. We're far past the days of just Austria fighting Serbia over Franz Ferdinand. Now what we're going to see is the alliance system will continue to trigger. We're going to see just a bit of a rundown. Okay. So on August the 25th, Japan will declare war on Germany. Never mind what you think from World War II, Japan is a member of the Allied powers in the First World War. On August the 25th, they declare war on Austria-Hungary. On August 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Belgium, which makes sense from just kind of a moralist standpoint, I guess. But they're not exactly close. It's not like Austria-Hungary is going to go rampage through... it's not like they're going to go rampage through Belgium. Then what happens is on October 29th, one of the things we'll talk about, not next week because that's our exam, but we'll pick up with Unit 5, is with the war at sea, 2 German ships of the Mittelmeer Division, or the Mediterranean Division, they realized that, look, they're not going to make it back to the North Sea. The British and the French Navy outnumber them. So the Germans decide to give them to the Turks. And these are, of course, the battlecruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau. And so what happens is they're effectively sold for next to nothing to the Ottoman Empire. They're renamed. The Goeben becomes the Yavuz Sultan Selim, and the Breslau becomes the Midli. But they retain their German crew. They retain their commander, Admiral Wilhelm Souchon. And what happens is on October 29, Souchon, without orders, without authorization from the Turks, sails his ships through the Dardanelles, where's my mouse, right here, and basically starts raiding Russian positions on the Black Sea. Now, what's happened is German ships with German crews under a German commander, but flying a Turkish flag, have shelled Russian positions. This effectively was a fait accompli by Germany to bring the Ottomans into the war. And it works because on November the 1st, 1914, the Russian Empire declares war on the Ottoman Empire. And so what's happening is very quickly these alliance systems are starting to trigger. Montenegro, France, and Britain all declare war on the Ottomans between November 3 and 5. And then on the 11th of November, and what ironically will be the anniversary of the ending of the war, just 4 years earlier, Sultan Mehmet V will declare jihad, or holy war, against the Allies. And so what does all of this mean? A very limited conflict that broke out right here in July 1914 now spans the world. I understand, we're going to call this a world war. And this is actually what, people would call this the Great War, the war to end all wars, the World War. And the reason is now there's going to be fighting in Europe, well, duh. There's going to be fighting in Africa, which we'll cover in our next unit. Fighting in the Middle East, think Lawrence of Arabia, think the Australians at Beersheba. And there's going to be fighting in the Pacific. What the hell? Germany and Austria-Hungary are in Europe? That's true. But also remember that Germany has colonial possessions. So here, from the 7th of November 1914, are Japanese artillery crews shelling Tsingtao. Yes, it's in China, but this was the main German base in the Far East. This is truly a worldwide conflict. Now, what all this means, especially with our concept of industrial warfare, is that Europe will be the main focus, and everybody knows that. Even things such as fighting the Ottomans will be considered sideshows. But what this means is the Central Powers are now surrounded. Bismarck's nightmare was the idea of Russia on one side, France on the other. Now it's literally the whole world on one side and the rest of the world on the other. Germany will not have the resources to match all these nations. Britain can bring supplies in from the empire. Remember, Britain has the largest empire the world has ever seen. It can bring stuff from Australia, from New Zealand, from the Pacific, from India, from Malaysia, from Borneo, from Africa, from Canada, from the United States. France can bring stuff from Africa, from Indochine. All this stuff. And Germany does have some stuff in Africa, But remember, the whole issue of why Germany wants this navy, this place in the sun, my navy, as Wilhelm II said, none of that matters, because with everybody piling into the war, the German Hochseeflotte, or High Seas Fleet, is entirely inadequate. There is no way, and I don't even mean in just a knockdown, slug-out, straight-up battle, just in terms of running supplies or outright challenging, there is no way the German Navy could possibly get supplies regularly through to the mainland of Germany. Because it also doesn't help that, well, you can't go through the Mediterranean and get to Austria-Hungary, especially once Italy comes in 1915. The Ottomans are too far away. There's not really a good rail line. So you've got to go through here, the North Sea. And the British, right through here, between Scotland and Norway, are going to mine the hell out of it. Germany is isolated. And so one thing to understand, one of the narratives that I'm going to try to push in this course is that Germany's chance to end the war all but ends on the 12th of September, 1914. Once they lose the Battle of the Marne, that's basically it. There's not much that they can do. And so what happens, the great crime of the First World War, is that it's going to continue. Both sides begin to dig in. And this is, we've talked about the race to the sea, and you hopefully watched that doc from the Great War series. But why this is so important is, think about it. Everybody's war plan was about a short, quick war. I mean, this is, everybody's plan was literally they're just going to pop into Walmart for 5 minutes, not stay there for 10 hours and buy the whole store. And so the issue is, I have no idea where that analogy came from, by the way. It's gone. But the point is, everybody's exhausted. These trenches were supposed to be temporary. The idea was dig the trench now, October, November 1914. Then in the spring, you can resume mobile warfare. And that's the big thing. Armies at this time believed in the concept of mobile warfare. What do they have to maintain that mobility? Well, they don't, obviously they don't have, tanks. They don't have, they have some armored cars, but they don't really have tanks. But what they have is cavalry. That's what they're used to. Sweeping advances, getting around behind the enemy. That's what they were expecting. But because of this race to the sea, because everybody digs trenches, and because everybody has time, these trenches are going to become incredibly tough. Now, let's assume you're digging trenches in the 19th century. Say, Siege of Petersburg, during the American Civil War. Well, you could still have open warfare. Why? Because it's just guys with rifles. But that's not the case in 1914. Think about it. Early on, and we'll talk about this in a second, machine guns are not that common. Yes, the Germans might have entire MG companies, but an MG company might be 6 machine guns. You might have a brigade pull its companies to make a battalion. But in general, 2 machine guns would be parceled out for every infantry battalion, which what that would mean is for every 400 or 500 guys, maybe 600 guys, you'd have 2 machine guns. They're not that many. But as you take time, and as people realize, wait a minute, these machine guns are heavy. They need to be set up. We don't want to move these things. Trench warfare, that's the ticket. They're force multipliers. Think about it. Imagine if you have, the only prop I have close to hand is this Italian Vetterli Vitali Carcano, made in 1889. And by the way, I'll talk about this more in this weapon in a second. This is the dumbest weapon in human history. I cannot stress that enough. Let's assume you have guys armed with rifles, and especially in this case, older rifles. Okay, at most 12 shots a minute, but not sustained fire. They're not trained that way. They're still trained for volley firing. But with a machine gun, weapons that can put out 550 rounds a minute, 550 rounds a minute with a 4-man crew versus, that would take, 12 shots a minute, 10, that'd take 50 guys. 1 machine gun and 4 crew take the place of 50 guys and 50 rifles. This is not hard to figure out. Now you group these machine guns together, begin putting 1 for every 20 yards, and suddenly you have a hell of a lot of firepower. And think about it, you cannot flank the enemy. You can't get around him. You can't attack him from the rear. And I was thinking, attacking from the rear. People in the 19th century, they liked butt stuff, apparently. That's center point to military tactics. So the only thing you can do is the frontal assault. The only thing you can do is charge at this just line of riflemen, each who might be able to steady their rifles. And so why is that important? Because while you are running, okay, and you're probably not taking the time to stop and shoot, there's no cover. These guys have their rifles rested on parapets. They've got them rested on sandbags. They're going to be a hell of a lot more accurate. Okay, so the machine guns can put down just this swath of fire to pin you down. And then when you get up, you've got riflemen, okay, that can effectively shoot you. As I said, this weapon, this Vetterli Vitali Carcano, was made in 1889. Okay, so this predates World War I. But if you look at the sight, and I don't know if this will work, we'll try it. We'll see if you can read the numbers. You'll see a 20, a 20. Okay, so already from 1889, this weapon is calibrated to 2,000 meters. Now you're going to see something that far? Well, I sure as hell am not with these Coke bottle glasses, but somebody else might. Actually, that's what you would think. What really would happen, and this is how they were trained, at 300 to 500 yards, you would mark your target. You're going to shoot at whatever you can see. But what they would actually do is they would have a guy with rangefinders. And what he would do, it's almost like naval warfare. Your officer would call down, set sight, 1,800 meters, okay? Because he's got a rangefinder you can see, and you would volley fire. Everybody would fire. And why you'd have to do a rangefinder is this. Let's set this for 1,800 meters. There we go. Okay, so let's get it. Look at that sight. Look how far. I've got to kick it up like that. Well, unless I put my head all the way down here. No. The idea is put it in the shoulder, and you're arcing up. You're basically blind firing. Okay? And so what they would do is say, okay, just everybody fire, everybody fire, everybody fire. And it might work, it might not. But you've just got a swath of bullets coming in. You've got machine guns firing, artillery. And what that does, that's going to, that's going to be a huge morale hit. That's going to start killing people. And then at about 500 yards from the trenches, if that, you've got this damsome new device. You've got barbed wire. And what this barbed wire is going to do is it stop. I mean, come on, this hurts. I mean, this is designed. Barbed wire is one of those things that was great for human advancement until somebody figured out how to appropriate it for military use. What do I mean? This comes from the American Southwest. How can you fence off your farm so that a cow doesn't come over and take a giant dump on your crops? Okay, that's literally what barbed wire is for. But then somebody thought, what if we put this around trenches? Well, think about it. You can't grab it. Ow, that hurts. So what happens is you've made this charge, you're running up there, then you got to stop and clip your way through this wire under machine gun fire, under artillery fire, making really nice big targets for enemy marksmen to shoot. It is an absolute bloodbath. And this is the only way to take trenches. This is frontal assaults. The number one thing you do not want to do in modern warfare. And so what industrial warfare really gets at is you need to be able to produce a lot of rifles, both for your side to defend your trench. Let's assume you're the defender. So apparently we're all German, so God save the Kaiser. Okay? You've got to produce rifles, machine guns, stuff for your side. You've got to produce, equipment, helmets, all that. You've got to produce barbed wire for your side. But you've also got to produce artillery to try to get through that barbed wire. You've got to produce all of this stuff, trying to be able to break it. And so what we're going to see, what happens is this is basically a war of attrition. I can't break through your trench. You can't break through my trench. So who has the greater industrial capacity? Who has the ability to build more siege artillery in the case of these British 9.2-inch guns? Who has the capability to build more rifles, more machine guns, to output more, even boards, to build up trenches, more barbed wire? Whoever can build the most stuff will win this war. And so what we're going to see is industrial warfare coupled with the race to the sea, meant that by the 19th of October, 1914, the entire front line is occupied. This is the birth of trench warfare. Now, how do we figure this out with frontal assault? Simple. the recipe for a stalemate in any kind of war is this. Trench warfare, so we're going to dig in, plus machine guns, plus artillery. Is the First World War a machine gun war? No. Is the First World War an artillery war? No. It is both. And fun fact, for those of you history majors talking about that want to go to grad school, I have a funny story from my thesis defense. My thesis, if you're interested, which you can read at the OSU library, dealt with the U.S. Army's acquisition of breech-loading rifles in the late 19th century. And in my thesis defense, I literally was ambushed and was asked by faculty members what kind of war I thought the First World War I can talk, the Second World War I, but what kind it was. And one faculty member believed it was an artillery war, one believed it was a machine gun war. The fact is, I'm going to argue it's actually something of both. What do I mean by that? Artillery is the greatest killer. There's just no doubt about that. But you don't have enough artillery shells until late in the war. So I would argue that in the early phase of the war, the machine gun is the greater killer. But by 1916, it turns to the artillery. But whether it's an 8mm round from a Maschinengewehr 1908, or whether it's a 75mm shrapnel round from a model 1897 field gun, it doesn't matter. The fact is, this is insanely deadly. And this is going to last from October 1914 all the way to about November 1918. The last few weeks of the war, we actually see open warfare. And irony of ironies, this is the really screwed up part about trench warfare. I want to give you the opinion, and I'd say in my next slide talking about the First Battle of Ypres, that this is hell on earth, that this sucks. Here's the thing. Trench warfare saves lives. The hell do I mean? Simple. Artillery in the age fired off, rather than high explosive, rather than things that make the giant Michael Bay explosions, fired shells that had what we called shrapnel. And what shrapnel was is shrapnel basically fired, when the shell exploded, it was filled with between 100 and 500 effectively musket balls. Things maybe about this size. This is a plastic thing about 25 millimeters wide. And so, maybe this might actually be a little bit bigger. Maybe nickel might be, nickel's probably, more appropriate. Stuff like this. And there would be cylindrical balls, and the idea is it blows, and it's basically just a big-ass shotgun. Just boom over the battlefield. Well, here's the thing. You're in a trench, so the only way that can really hurt you, assuming you don't get a direct hit in that trench, which would be exceedingly rare, is if one burst right above your head. And that's why 1916 we get the adoption of the Stahlhelm, the Adrien helmet, and the Brodie helmet, the shrapnel helmet. Okay. High explosive was used. High explosive was much better, but it was more expensive to make. It was more complex, and also armies liked shrapnel because what they literally believed is if you exploded shrapnel, it would shred the barbed wire. It didn't. You want high explosive to literally pick up the earth and just excavate it, but they don't make enough of it. Upwards of 75% of all shells fired by artillery would be shrapnel rounds. Now, what does that have to do with trench warfare being safe? Simple. Late in the war, when the guys actually leave the trenches, get out, on the move, suddenly shrapnel does exactly what it's supposed to. Imagine you've got a rank of about 1,000 guys, and you just have 20 massive shotgun blasts, just boom, sending about 2,000 lead balls careening through this rank. It chews people up. Trench warfare saves lives in that regard, but it expends lives trying to take it. And that's why this is stalemate. This is why people should have just packed it in. And in fact, Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff that replaces von Moltke, who has that nervous breakdown after von Kluck, makes his turn. Von Falkenhayn will say by December 1914, victory is impossible. The Germans knew at the end of the first year of the war they could not win, but duty and honor demanded they keep fighting. Wilhelm II, when he basically issues the war declaration speech, he said that the sword has been pulled from the scabbard. I can only sheathe it again with honor. This is still the long 19th century, when people wanted to act with chivalry, which also meant that if, 4 million people gotta die, so you can say, hey, I acted honorably, then 4 million people gotta die. And it's terrible when we think about it a century later, but at the time, it simply made sense to people. And so what we see is 5 separate engagements from October 19 to the 22nd of November 1914. And these are collectively known as the First Battle of Ypres, a battle site that will become incredibly infamous in military history. The first battle, not so much. But as more and more British soldiers die there through the first and the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth battle, and Ypres becomes in the British slang wipers, well, how bad does it get? The Germans, trying to force a breakthrough at the second battle in 1915, deploy something known as phosgene gas. And what we're going to see, actually it should be chlorine gas, and what we're going to see is this is where the war will become even deadlier. These are the first battles of trench warfare. And what we see is each side tries to attack the other trench. Bear in mind they're exhausted, but trying to force a breakthrough. Force some salient in the front. Push through just that little bit so you can get in behind. But neither side can do it. Nobody has the appropriate artillery to bust through the trench line. Nobody's got enough machine guns to be able to do this. And bear in mind, if you're attacking an enemy trench, your machine guns can only do so much. The damn things weigh between 50 and 143 pounds. They are not man-portable. Okay? These are not... I love Battlefield 1, I do. But, think about it. We live in the era of stuff like this, the AR-15, where everything is, full auto, semi-auto, whatever. And if you've ever played Battlefield 1, that's what it tries to suggest World War I is. Because they literally go through and every possible prototype weapon, that's what they try to use. The reality is 99.9999999% of people had a single-shot bolt-action rifle. Well, repeating rifle. I mean, it has a magazine. You get machine gun or submachine guns late in the war. You get some shotguns in America late in the war. But for most people, it's a bolt-action rifle. And so the thing is, machine guns are not man-portable. We'll talk about it in a second. But the concept of the light machine gun doesn't exist yet. We're not going to see that until at least 1916 with the mass adoption of the Lewis gun. Okay? The concept of the automatic rifle, something equivalent to semi-autos like this. Fun fact, the United States, the model 1918 Browning automatic rifle. A weapon so good, we will use it in Korea. In fact, actually, Korea is its last combat deployment. It's still being used in the early stages of Vietnam, though I don't believe any actually go overseas. And the concept between the Army's modern M249 squad automatic weapon was literally to combine the light machine gun M60 with the firepower of the model 1918 Browning automatic rifle. Okay, we still use the 249 today. Okay, we have 1918. That's World War I. We don't send them overseas. Why? We are terrified that Germans are going to reverse engineer it, so we don't frickin' use them. My point is this. If you're attacking a trench, you don't have a weapon that pew, 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 pew. You don't have that. You don't have, this idea that everybody's got grenades. Grenades are not mass issued until late in the war, and even then, not every soldier would get them. You would have specialized, what were called bombers, who literally might not have a rifle. They might have a pistol, because their idea is they're going to get close, and they're going to fling their Mills bombs, or Stielhandgranaten, or whatever. Stoßtruppen, Sturmpioniere, assault engineers, they're going to carry your grenades. But your average doughboy, your average Tommy, your average poilu, your average Frontschwein, they are not going to have grenades. They're not going to have a pistol. They're not going to have access to a machine gun. They're literally going to carry a rifle that, boom, work the bolt, boom. Why am I saying that? Machine guns at this stage are defensive weapons. By the way, I'm sorry, I realized this was supposed to be about industrial warfare. Now we're talking about tactics, but Trust me, we are going to do Euroculture stuff, but I'm a military historian. This is what interests me. I really hope this is what interests you as well. But machine guns are defensive weapons, and that's why trench warfare is so bloody. And it's also what makes it so bloody is you cannot carry that firepower with you. Okay? We'll talk about this more in a second, but, I've got a sign where I'm going to talk about some of the different types of machine guns. They are not highly mobile weapons. So that means when you're attacking a trench, it's just literally your rifle, your bayonet, your 60 rounds of ammunition. And for a close-in weapon, because your rifle and bayonet are so freaking long, okay, that what we're at, again, I don't have my Lee Enfield here, but this is a pattern 19.7 bayonet for a Lee Enfield rifle. The blade alone is 12 inches long. Okay, these are weapons left over from the 19th century. The idea being that with your rifle, you can stab, as an infantryman, stab a dude off horseback. Okay? Look at the size of these. This is a photo from German troops Christmas in 1914. Note the Christmas tree. Look how long these rifles are. These are the Gewehr 1898s, like what I showed the other day. These are not suitable for trench warfare. These are not, that long. Well, they're that long. They're not that handy. So your close-in weapon is not a pistol. It's not a submachine gun. It's not a grenade. You'd grab your entrenching tool and you'd literally beat somebody to death with it. Or with your spade, pop somebody right there with it in an upward motion, catch them right under the chin, and you'd literally sever the head and knock their head off. This is absolutely brutal. Which is why, okay, we see that neither side can make a breakthrough. Both sides are throwing in new recruits. Both sides are throwing in the new guys. And literally casualties might be as high as 70%. In one of the small battles, the Germans, the English translation is the Massacre of the Innocents. Because literally in one battalion of new kids, something like 85% of them died trying to take a British trench. It's that horrible. By the end of this battle, 46,000 German and 58,000 Allied casualties. 1914, believe it or not, is the deadliest year of the war for France, with an average death rate of 2,200 people per day from the declaration of war through New Year's Eve. 2,200 people a day dying. To put that in modern perspective, that would be the equivalent of every person that has died in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. We lose all of that in a week. Okay, that's what we're talking about. Why? Because doctrinal advance has not caught up, that these trenches are just too tough and you cannot break through. And what makes this so ironic is the soldiers were done. They're just done. They don't want to keep fighting this. It's now Christmas 1914. This is when the war was supposed to be over. Remember, the war will be over by Christmas. And so what we see is the war stalemates. And so what happens is something that has happened since time immemorial. Think about it. Your average poilu doesn't want to fight the Frontschwein. The Tommy doesn't care about the Frontschwein. Okay, Tommy being slang for British soldier, poilu being literally meaning dirty one for French soldier, and Frontschwein, I think it's more of a World War II term, but basically what the Germans would have called themselves. They don't care about the concerns for the war. They don't care why Austria declared war on Serbia or why these alliance systems or any of that. So spontaneously, troops want some sort of truce. Now, early on, and I've got a couple of videos that I will post. One is actually a British chocolate commercial, kind of showing just how even today that's still cemented in the British psyche, the magic of the Christmas truce. Another is a clip from a very good movie called Joyeux Noël, which of course means Merry Christmas. Which Joyeux Noël, it's a co-production between Germany, Britain, and France to tell the story of this truce. We know the popular image. We know this. And we have photographic evidence of British and German and French and German soldiers intermingling. There are statues commemorating the famed football match that people were even writing about in 1918. of these guys playing footy together. But, sorry, I got an itch. Darn it. What we're going to see, though, is early on it wasn't that easy. The first few people, and this has been documented, they tried to get out of their trenches, wanted to say, hey, let's have a truce, are cut down by rifle fire and snipers. Eventually, it keeps happening enough where people say, okay, let's have an informal truce. Let's, meet together. Let's sing Christmas carols. Let's exchange gifts. Let's drink booze. Let's talk about the war. There'll even be a mini truce on New Year's Eve. And why this is so important is your average soldier shared more in common with the guy on the other side than the officers and the politicians. Of course, the officers and the politicians are horrified. They were worried about treason. They're going to stop the leaves of people where this had happened, not letting them go home. German troops will be transferred to the Eastern Front for fear of fraternization because the kings wanted the war. The politicians wanted the war. But the guys who actually stared death in the face every frickin' day, they didn't want the war. They wanted it over. They didn't want to fight. A German didn't want to kill an Englishman. An Englishman, a Frenchman didn't want to kill a German. And so what we're seeing is this is a war that truly nobody actually wanted. This is something that people did not want. It was thrust on them. And the officers who believed in the cause and the politicians who had the most to lose from peace wanted to keep it going. And go it did. Because what we're going to see is industrial warfare meant that this was... I don't know what... I'm about to scratch my back with this bayonet, but I don't think that'd be that professional. And for those of you just listening to this instead of watching it, probably going, what the hell is this guy saying? I try to keep it fun. What can I say? Think about it. You're going to have a lot of guys in uniform. These guys need bayonets, they need scabbards, they need belts, they need webbing, they need boots, they need puttees, they need rifles, they need cleaning kits, helmets, uniforms, yada, da, 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 da. They need all this stuff, and not just one-to-one. They need stuff to make up for spillage, wastage, if some gets ruined, if it falls apart, overuse, all that. As people begin to get conscripted or mass volunteer, you don't have that many people working in factories. So we start to see this changing of social norms. Britain responds by letting, women come into the factories. Germany refuses. And why that's so important is Germany is already staring down the face of this, look, Germany can't make enough stuff as it is, and they're refusing to let women in the factories. Why are they doing that? Simple. What the hell are you fighting for? What is your war aim if your social norms, if the way you do things breaks down? Does that make sense? Not really. Not today. Not in the legacy of Rosie the Riveter. But at the time, again, you're not that far removed from this idea of separate spheres, where women apparently only, and we just went over this in my 1919 to 45 class, but, spoiler, that's a fun class. We actually watch gangster movies, just gonna, fling that out there. But, this is the idea where literally women were believed you just exist at home to make babies and run the household. So to say that you can build rifles, you can work in factories, you can do a man's job, that would have been... And I mean, come on, some of this stuff, it's still in our culture today. I remember, I'm not that old, okay? I'm, 32, I think? Sure, 32. Okay? I remember, my father as a kid would often say, that's woman's work, if he didn't want to do something. Still, again, the last vestiges of that separate spheres ideology. Well, Germany's not about to do that. Germany is too conservative. Britain, however, hell yes, we want to win this war. And so what we're going to see is the more people you have in the factories, that's more you can produce. The greater population, which Britain already has, means the more you can produce. And so the more you can produce of this stuff means victory. What stuff do we really need to produce? Again, machine guns. Okay, again, this is what I'm trying to say about, why this warfare is so deadly. This is the standard British heavy machine gun of the war. Okay, and what's the difference between a heavy machine gun, a medium machine gun, and a light machine gun? Okay, well, a heavy machine gun, and believe it or not, it's not about caliber. Okay, you can have heavy, medium, and light all in, 303 or 30 caliber or whatever. A heavy machine gun like the Vickers is something that you want to emplace and you want to leave there. You're not intending to move this. And with good reason. The weapon itself weighs 33 pounds. The tripod weighs another 20 pounds. You've got to carry 10 pounds worth of water. These are water-cooled machine guns, which means this big jacket you see around the barrel is what that does is water circulates in there so that as you fire it, the water cools the barrel. And as it heats up the water and it begins to bubble off, it comes down this tube you see here into a can it would be attached to called a condenser, where the steam would be, and then when it would condenses, another tube would feed it back into the barrel, where it again cool the water so you can keep firing. And the idea is you want sustained fire. Pop, 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 pop. Now here's the thing. These are great on the defense. In 1916, historian Ian Hogg recounted there was a machine gun company of, was it 4 machine guns that would, and you could actually swap out these barrels pretty quickly, in a 24-hour period, fired 1 million rounds, going through 100 barrels for each gun, so 25 barrels a gun, and didn't jam a single time. Okay, this was a brilliant weapon. And so what that means is, with 4 guns, if you've got the ammo for it, you can hold down an entire section of the front line. And that's the other thing. These are force multipliers. 600 guys, you're not going to do it. 4 of these, feed them with enough ammunition, give them good crews, give them enough barrels so you can swap it out. Because as it gets to, and why you would want to do that, is as the barrel gets too hot, you risk the chance of, a round jamming, you risk the chance of maybe a round cooking off and detonating in the chamber before you're ready to shoot. And as it heats, it expands, the bullet doesn't grip the rifling, and it becomes inaccurate, so you'd want quick change barrels. Well, all of that sounds great, but imagine what that takes, okay? You've got to have your 4-man crew. This weapon breaks down into a load of 3. 1 guy carries the gun, 1 guy carries the tripod, 1 guy carries the ammo and the rifle, and then 1 guy directs the fire of the gun. You can't move all, and if you're going to attach, more barrels, stuff like that, more ammo, you're going to have runners, that you cannot move that quickly. So this is not a weapon that you can move forward rapidly. We're going to see weapons like the Hotchkiss, the model 1914. Now this is what's called an air-cooled machine gun. And so this is what we would, we'd probably call this more a medium machine gun. Certainly the French did by 1940, spoiler alert, when they're still using it. Yes, the model 1914 is the standard medium machine gun of the French army in the Second World War as well. And you see, there's no barrel shroud. There's no water cooling. It just uses the surrounding air. So what that means is you can fire faster, but you can't fire sustained fire. Now, this weapon also weighs about 50 pounds, probably about 30 for the weapon, probably about 15 to 20 for the tripod. But you don't have to carry water with it. But it also, whereas the Vickers is belt fed, so you can put a belt of anywhere between 50 and 250 rounds on it and have a guy feeding it. The Hotchkiss used what was called a not clip fed, but it used kind of what's called a feed hopper. And you'd have strips of about, 30 rounds. You'd feed into the gun, pop, 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 works that, you'd feed in another, and so it's overall a slower rate of fire. But it is still deadly when served by a good crew. The Germans, the Maschinengewehr 1908, which this is a beastly weapon. You can put a frickin' scope on it. It is damn some accurate. Much like the Vickers, it is water cooled. But it's got this kind of interesting thing and this terrible thing. You see this huge tripod? It's a sled as well. So you can actually make it where you can, instead of one guy just carrying this tripod, this 20, 30 pound thing right here, you could literally kick out the sled and have the whole crew carrying the weapon together, moving it forward. That sounds awesome. Until you realize that the sled plus water, not even counting the water or ammo, the sled plus the gun weighed 143 pounds. Okay? I'm going to do some basic math. 143 divided by 4. You know what? For those of you that are historians, you know that I busted my ass for C in college, algebra years ago. That's what I have to say. Okay, so about 35 pounds. That's not terrible, But what happens if one of your guys gets hit? What happens if you're moving this weapon forward? Okay, one of your dudes gets hit. Now suddenly you're carrying 50 pounds. You're literally having to carry the weight as if you're carrying this by yourself. And the weapon on the offensive becomes not feasible. Despite the fact, again, you have to have a guy carrying the water. You got to have a guy carrying the ammo. It simply doesn't work. And it's the same problem that will bedevil the Russian Model 1910 Maxim, which they will use all the way through the Second World War, even into the Cold War. And frankly, I've seen pictures that the Ukrainian army still today trains on World War II examples. It's the same thing. It too has a sled. Now, thankfully, the Russians were smart. They put wheels on it. So you can have one or two guys drag this thing. So this is much more portable than those other weapons, but it still suffers from the same innate difficulties. Getting this thing over rough ground, not that easy. Moving fast with something you've got to lean down and tow, not that easy. You still got to have a guy carry the ammo, a guy with the water. And so this is primarily a defensive weapon. And for those of you wondering, what's the United States doing? We can't choose a machine gun. To quote the U.S. Army Field Service Regulations of 1914, as revised in 1916, and I quote, "Machine guns are an emergency weapon that should be assigned to no more than 50 per infantry division." That's 50 for every 2,000 guys. Or 20,000 guys, excuse me. Fact is, we don't see the machine gun as popular, which is why we're training in World War I on this. The Colt Browning Model 1895. A terrible weapon that saw many different calibers, that's called the potato digger because its charging handle, as it fires, flicks up under the gun. And so if you tried to emplace this, it would literally kick up dirt and then get it into the magazine, or into the mechanism. This weapon did see combat, though. What do you mean? Because Teddy Roosevelt private purchased 2 of them to take up San Juan Hill. That's how old machine guns we're wanting to use, even into 1916. So you got to find better weapons. You've got to find weapons that work. You've got to try to figure out ways that you can slim some of this stuff down to make it man portable. You got to build a lot of them. You got to build a lot of artillery, like the French 75. You've got to try to make it more man portable, lighter, better. Okay, the light field gun is the dominant artillery piece of 1914. And it's quick moving, it's rapid firing, it's good, and it works for open warfare. And this is the shrapnel thing, like what I was talking about. But it is absolutely useless in trench warfare. My dissertation was on American artillery in the First World War. And, one of the problems with the field gun, and I mentioned this, is it fires in a flat trajectory. So, you might hit the barbed wire, you might hit behind, but to score a direct hit inside the trench, that would be absolute luck. You've got to have howitzers, which they do have, just not in ample supply. And the Germans, after the Russo-Japanese War, revive a medieval concept, the mortar. This is the German Model 1910 25 centimeter Schwer Minenwerfer, or heavy mortar bomb thrower. Why? Because it arcs up, comes down into the trench. That's what you want to kill guys. That's what you want to break through the lines. The problem is, in industrial warfare, it takes time to build something new. It takes time to tool up factories. So you've got to build a lot of stuff in this war of attrition, but at the same time, you've got to build the correct stuff, and that's the types of problem. It's also not just that. You have to build enough shells. I'm not sure if it's accurate, but I saw a statistic earlier today that the French Army, in I believe it was 1916, fired 330 million rounds of artillery ammunition. That worked out to something like 210,000 rounds per week, or something like that. Think about it, 330 million rounds. You've got to build them all to a certain specification so they actually fit in weapons like the Schneider Model 1913 howitzer. You've got to make sure the damn things explode. Fun fact, we'll get back to that with the Battle of the Somme. British ones don't. You've got to make them do all that stuff, But it's not just that. And that's the thing with industrial warfare. It gets exponentially more complicated the more you do this. What the hell do I mean? You have to build the factories to produce this stuff. Then you have to get the people to build the stuff. Then you have to get the materiel to build the stuff. Then you have to get, actually build the stuff. But then you have to build the railroads to carry it, the trains to move it, the ships to cart it over the English Channel. Or the Atlantic if it's coming from the United States. Then you have to build the trains to move it, through the trenches and all that. And so what we're seeing is this is just a massive undertaking. And everybody is going to be able to do it. And so what we're going to see early on, and I mentioned this, those pre-war stocks of ammunition, they're gone. I mean, by October, they've all but been depleted. Artillery simply can't fire enough. Artillery will pick up in 1915, but it will be until 1916 before artillery reaches the front, both in terms of guns and ammunition in the quantity required, because this takes time. And it's not just that. If all of this is about frontal assaults, if all of this is just a giant meat grinder of attrition, you got to have people. And so you've got to have labor. You've got to have human beings. And you can't just literally give somebody a rifle and send them on their way. Though I think that happened to an Italian with his Federale Vitale Carcano, which I'll explain why this is terrible in just a second. But what this meant is modern industrial warfare meant that, there's going to be offensives in 1915, but the war's not going to take off. We're going to talk things like the Second Battle of Ypres. Gas warfare. Holy crap, it works. It blows a 20-mile gap in the lines. But you don't have enough guys to do anything about it. Because, one, you never thought about it. And two, the guys just aren't there. This is attrition. As Douglas Haig, later commander of the British Expeditionary Force, will say, whoever has the most number of guys at the end of the war wins. And this is going to be a long war. There are massive casualties. And so why don't people pack it in? Simple. If you've got a few, 100,000 people dead, you got to be able to tell your, people why they died. Okay, especially if you don't want social revolution, you have to give people something. There are still no true war aims. It's just simply, I feel attacked, so I've got to fight. And despite the fact that von Falkenhayn says, look, warfare we're not going to win, many people still think the war will be won. Many people think the spring offensive will do it. And so although soldiers are weary, although they don't necessarily want to fight, they're not disillusioned. They still believe in their cause. They still believe that they can win. And so what we're going to see is the end of 1914 is only the first act in a long drama that, hopefully throughout this course, I really hope so that, I gave a lecture years ago at a high school, which, fun fact, is the only time I taught in a high school, and I will never do it again, but it was over the First World War. And as I explained this, I explained what trench warfare was, and I explained the suicidal attacks. This one 13-year-old kid goes, well, that's stupid. And I wasn't even mad, because he's absolutely right. Who the hell thought this was a good idea? But honor demands it, and so they kept doing it. So, as this kind of ends Unit 1, I'll go ahead and talk about this real quick, and then I want to talk about your exam briefly. Why is this a stupid weapon? The Italians enter the war in 1915, entirely unprepared. So what they did is they took these old Federale Vitales, long since rendered obsolete by the model 1891 Carcano. And what they did is they ripped out the magazine, put in a Carcano-esque magazine, and they sleeved the barrel. These are 10.4 millimeter rifles. The Carcano fires a 6.5 millimeter cartridge. So what they did is they heated up the barrels, got them super hot, they chilled 6.5 millimeter barrels, shoved it in, and then let them cool. Why? Because as the heated 10.4 cooled and contracted, and the chilled 6.5 warmed and expanded, they would cold weld together. Now, if that doesn't sound terrible, what's really terrible is the issue of heat treating. Black powder, which this rifle originally was, is an explosive. Smokeless powder is a propellant. You do not, if you ever want to know why I don't do this, just YouTube smokeless powder and a black powder rifle. You'll see numbers of guns blowing up. Well, somebody one time chambered around and fired it in this. And what happened, and you're not going to be able to see it, there is a giant crack right here in the receiver. Some Italian soldier was nearly killed because this thing damn near blew up in his face. And so that's one of the reasons I have this in my collection. It's just kind of a memento to that just desperation. We need weapons. This is a war of attrition. And when you assume that people are going to die, when you assume that 30% casualties is conservative, give them an unsafe weapon. It's totally fine. They'll die anyway. And that's going to be the mindset. So this will kind of end it for Unit 1. I'll probably post a documentary tomorrow just to kind of, cement everything, kind of give good review material. Remember that your exam is next week. I'll post a video talking about that tomorrow, how to download the Lockdown browser. But how the exam is going to work is that what you'll need to do is of the ID list, you'll be taking a timed quiz where of the 25 IDs, I will post 10 of them, and you need to answer the 5 you know best. And so what you need to do is be able to tell me the who is involved, what the term is, when it takes place. The year is what I will need. If you want to give me the exact date, that would be awesome. Year is all I'm going for. Why it happened, and then what the broader historical significance is. Now, I should mention, I consider myself a softy grader. Just convince me that you know the material. Convince me you watched these videos, that you've read the books, that you took something from the documentaries, and you will be fine. So, you have 25 minutes, about 5 minutes each. Just give me good, solid answers. No single sentence answers. 3 to 5 sentences for each one. The other thing is I will give you what I call an essay exam. Proctor exams kind of suck. I'm trying to spare you guys from that. So what I do is I'm going to give you a list of 4 essay prompts. I want you to write 2 responses, 1 to 2. I want you to choose 2 of them and write responses to them. And what I want you to do is, rather than do it from memory, I want you to effectively write me miniature research papers. I want 2 to 3 pages for each prompt. I want you to answer them fully. I want you to cite in Turabian style, which I'll go over in the video tomorrow, from my lectures, from the books, from the memoirs, from the documentaries. Back up where you got it. Because what I want to do is, in this case, I want to test your ability to take all of this information, see what's important, write about it, distill it, and tell me where you got it. It should be fairly easy, but, as always, if you have questions, please let me know. I'm intending on posting that on Monday. I normally do it on Tuesday, but I think I'll do Monday just as a change. And it'll be Monday at 10 a.m. You'll have until Friday at midnight to get it in. As always, if you need an extension, things like that, please let me know. And also remember that your memoir reviews are going to be due on Friday. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know. Stay safe out there. And whatever you do, if you decide to go invade a country, use Blitzkrieg. Don't get mired in trench warfare. It kind of sucks. And on that note, I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.